This particular study was completed by myself, John Geringer, and David Miller, who are both here. And I just wanted to acknowledge them as I begin. So we're interested a little bit in noise-induced hearing loss and how that is potentially impacting musicians. So noise-induced hearing loss refers to any loss of hearing resulting from overexposure to sound. And that can be continual sound at a certain threshold. Usually 85 decibels and lower is considered relatively safe. Or it could be a really high decibel sudden impact, like for instance, a gunshot. And that can damage your ear. Musicians, we think, have an increased risk for noise-induced hearing loss. There's quite a bit of research that shows that there's more hearing loss, particularly hearing notches, for musicians. So we know that musicians are at an increase for noise-induced hearing loss. We also know that proper earplug use can mitigate risk for noise-induced hearing loss. But finally, we know that musicians seem to not like to use earplugs, and earplug use is low. One of the reasons I started this study is I work at UNCG, the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and we've had a hearing conservation policy at my university since I've been there 15 years. And that conservation policy has involved testing every single music student, and we have about 600 in any given year, every single year. And so we have quite a bit of data now across the 15 years of many, many music students in collaboration with the audiology department. So we really stress the importance of protecting their hearing. And yet recently, one of my colleagues gave the music education students a survey, and over 70% of them thought that hearing loss could be corrected or healed, and it cannot be. So the question becomes, why do musicians not want to wear earplugs? And the research has shown that musicians don't enjoy earplugs and have reported a loss of monitoring ability. They experience alteration of timbre. Sometimes the earplugs are uncomfortable. They get a feeling of pressure in the ear. It can interfere with intonation perception. Reduced sound quality was experienced. Sometimes an occlusion effect is created. And there was deteriorated localization ability. So we decided to pull one of those variables, which was pitch, and go ahead and look at the effect of wearing earplugs on musicians' pitch perception across 3 conditions. We used the participants from my university. They were undergraduate and graduate students seeking degrees in music. 47 were music education, 20 were music performance, and 5 were in music-related degrees. As I said, we had 3 conditions. So one was foam earplugs, which were chosen because they're commonly used. These are Etymotic musicians' earplugs, and I'll explain a little more about them. They're referred to as Etyplugs. And then our third condition was just your ear. So we chose the foam earplugs because these are the earplugs that you would buy at Staples or Home Depot, or your standard just industrial foam earplug. These are the earplugs that my school has in our library. So students can walk by and it's like a bowl of candy. They can just pick one up and take it. They are individually wrapped, just in case that sounded scary. The overall noise reduction rating that's reported on foam earplugs is 33 decibel. Etymotic earplugs, we chose these as our second because they are marketed as a high definition earplug. They're non-custom and they purport an equal sound reduction of 20 decibels for the most part across frequencies. They're also relatively inexpensive. So musicians' earplugs that are customized, that are active high fidelity, they run very expensive and they do have much better efficacy. But these earplugs run about $12 to $13 a pair and have been adopted by several professional symphonies in the United States as the earplugs of use. Among them is the Pittsburgh Symphony. All symphony musicians in the Pittsburgh Symphony are supposed to, most of them do, wear the Etyplugs during rehearsals and performance. So we had to think about how we were going to test for tuning and what would be the most natural type of tuning. So we chose to have an oboe acoustic tone as our reference stimulus sound. And we had that professional oboist, we recorded her, play a C sharp. And we did that because we didn't want to use A440 or another very commonly used tuning pitch. So we had participants simultaneously, so as if it were happening, through one speaker came the reference tone and the other the stimulus tone. And again, I'll give a little more information in a minute. There were 5 intervals that they were to tune: unison, an octave above, an octave below, the perfect fifth above, and the perfect fifth below. And we chose these intervals because they're perfect intervals and very, very commonly you find them in the music that we're playing. So what would happen is the reference tone would be played through one speaker, and then the stimulus tone would be presented to the listener at either 15 cents sharp, 15 to 20 cents sharp, or flat. So they would be presented with a tone that was not in tune. The first stimulus tone was the oboe sound, in tune. The second tone would be either sharp or flat, and they had the ability to tune the second pitch to the first. We used the CRDI, we adapted it. So you can see the CRDI is a continual response digital interface, and it's been used in quite a bit of research, even some of the research here, to measure a variety of things, one being aesthetic response. So we modified it and removed the dial, the face, and just became a knob. So what happened with the second tone is that the participant was able to turn the knob so that they could either lower the pitch or raise the pitch using the knob. I do have 2 examples of the task, and I wanted to play for you, and I'm very afraid that it might confuse you because there's no way for me to replicate the task over Zoom. Because in our tuning task, we had 2 speakers. So the original reference tone, the oboe tone, came out of one speaker, and then the second tone, which was an electronic tone, that we created, a complex tone that John created, that when we did that specifically, so we had 2 different types of sound waves to eliminate the obvious beats. So it compelled the user to have to really listen to the frequency. And so I'm going to play this example for you. You're going to hear beats, but you're only going to hear the beats because it's coming through your one speaker. Also, the clicking is just a manufacture of how we built this into the PowerPoint presentation. So, but here's the example because I want you to hear the 2 tones. Can you hear them? Were you able to hear the tones? Okay, good. I remembered to click. Okay. And so the user was allowed to spend, the participant was allowed to spend as long as they liked to get the tone in tune. Okay, I better leave time for the analysis. So we looked at the data 2 ways. So the way we collected the data was we looked at the cent deviation relative to equal temperament. And so if participants took the dial and they thought that was flat and tuned it up and they ended up slightly above what would be considered in tune, then we recorded that as a plus however many cents it was sharp or flat. So it could have been plus 5 cents, or maybe they tuned minus 5 cents. And that was relative to equal temperament. So we then realized we had to account for this 2 ways. One analysis was the directional deviation, which accounted for whether they tuned it higher or lower. And the other one, we calculated it so that we knew the absolute value of the distance from zero. So just if I could explain that quickly, if some of our users tuned 10 cents sharp and the other bunch of users tuned 10 cents flat, that could end up looking like in the analysis close to zero, when the actual pitch deviation was much farther than that. You'll see some of that in the analysis. So here's what we found. We did find a significant main effect between earplug conditions in our directional analysis. We also found one in the absolute analysis. So there was a difference between the three conditions. So here you can see very clearly in the absolute deviation without earplugs, 7 cents. With the Etymotic, it's really close to without earplugs, 7 cents. With the foam earplugs, we had a bit bigger difference. It seemed to interfere more with pitch perception. And you can see the standard deviations here. If we jump over to the directional analysis, you'll see, and rightly so, that there seems to be a tendency towards flat. And I'll explain that a bit in a minute, or I'll attempt to explain it. But you can see here how much closer to zero these look because they're directional, but how large the standard deviation is, showing you that there was a lot of variance in the tuning of our participants. There was also a difference between the initial presentation of the stimulus tone. And for terminology, what I mean by initial presentation was whether the tone was first presented flat or sharp. And we counterbalanced all of our designs for interval and flat versus sharp. So there were several orders. What we found was that in general, people tended to tune in the direction that it was initially presented. So I'll show you what that means. Just look down the unison category for me. Flat, this means that the tone was flat when it started. And the user was allowed to tune towards in tune. Well, the mean ended still flat. It started flat, it ended flat. It started sharp, it ended sharp. It started sharp, it ended sharp. So that was really consistent for 18 out of 20. These are the two outliers. They're very close to zero. When you're looking at this, you'll also see that there was a tendency for flat to be more flat. And when it was presented sharp, the participants did tune closer to in tune. And that's pretty consistent with previous research. Okay. In both the directional and absolute analysis, we found significant differences between the earplug conditions for the interval of octave above and octave below. So we can look here. This is where the big differences were occurring. So when they were trying to tune the C sharp and octave above the bass, the first oboe tone, you can see that they were I shouldn't say much less. This is 3 cents difference. So musically, that's not a lot. But there was a significant difference between no earplugs and the foam earplugs for these intervals. When you look at the octave below, it's even greater. People had trouble tuning the octave below as a general rule. And you can see the same. This was the directional analysis, incidentally. I put it in the lighter color. This is our absolute analysis, so it can show you the distance away. 2? Thank you. All right, so the absolute analysis also showed a difference for the octave and the fifth. The two descending intervals were tuned less accurately, approximately 5 cents, when stimulus tones were presented flat compared to sharp. The other intervals were tuned similarly, whether tuning from above or below. And that is shown here. So, and I'll just give you a second to see the difference in the flat direction. You can see how much farther it is. So there was no significant difference between pitch accuracy between no earplugs and Etyplugs. The Etyplugs worked fairly well. Foam earplugs definitely impacted pitch perception. Stimulus tones that were presented flat were tuned flat. Tones presented sharp or tuned sharp. There was an overall tendency to tune flat with all earplugs. The intervals of octave above and below were tuned less accurately with earplugs than without. And intervals of descending octave and perfect fifth were tuned less accurately when they were initially presented flat. And that concludes our analysis, and I probably hit just about on time.